Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our strength and our Redeemer. When I first saw the email from Sherry asking me if I would consider preaching this morning, and I thought, me? I'm not a preacher. I used to be married to one, and he was really good at it, and it's not my lane. But anyway, I opened the email. That was what was in the subject. The first thing is, would you consider preaching on February the 9th? And then I opened the email, and Sherry just said, I just want you to talk about how your faith interacts or intertwines with what you do. And I thought, yeah, I could do that. Because every time I talk to people about what I do, I'm really preaching about it. And that's a new decision for me to start saying yes to things instead of saying no, because my default is to say, no, of course not. But I decided, yeah, I'm going to say yes. So here I am. So what is my work? What has God called me to do with this life of mine? I've always known that there was a purpose and a reason I was put here on earth. And I always knew it was not just to take up space. I don't think any of us is put here on earth just to take up space. Some of us spend our time in JOBs, and some of us spend our time doing what we consider a calling. And it's usually something that brings solace to others and makes the world a better place for all humankind. The problem is, though, that many of us never ask God, what are you calling me to do? What is my purpose here on earth? I have been asking that my entire life. And that purpose was revealed to me on Sunday, November the 30th, 2014. Earlier in my life, as you heard Sherry just say, I was an Ontario provincial police officer for 6 years. And that weekend, we were in Peterborough celebrating the 40th anniversary of women in policing. Being in Peterborough was like going home for me because I went to university in Peterborough. I went to Trent. I was staying at the Holiday Inn, and as I opened the door, on the floor was the Toronto Star, and right on the cover of the Toronto Star, the big picture was about a guy who had jumped off the Millwood Bridge and committed suicide. I was about to just leave the newspaper, and then I thought, oh, I'll just take it home and read it. And then the next day, the newspaper had the front page article that a woman and her 2 children had been murdered. And they eventually connected the guy who had jumped off the bridge with the 3 people who had been murdered. The woman's name was Zara Abdili. And my heart hurt. I mean, it literally hurt. Because I was in the midst of writing a book about emotional abuse and how it undermines a person's self-confidence, self-esteem, and sense of self, and how insidious it is. And I remember saying to Zara, you will not die in vain. I also saw immediately in my mind a plaque on a wall beside a door which said, the Zara Abdili Center. At the time, I wanted it to be a place where women could go, or abused women could go, to get free legal support, because Zara had been denied legal services to go to court to get custody of her 2 children. She had left and gone to a shelter. And because she was a public health nurse, on paper she made money. And that's the only thing that legal aid looks at. What legal aid did not take into consideration was that she had no control over it as an abused woman. Eventually, she ended up going back home, and that's when she was murdered. And just in case you don't know, women who are or who have been in toxic relationships are killed every minute worldwide. Those are staggering numbers, and it's sometimes hard to get our heads around that. The idea stayed on the back burner, and sometimes God prodded me to think about it, but I went on with my life. I was working full-time in a very stressful job, but I still managed to train as a relationship coach. And I'm working towards a coaching practice, educating women about the dangers of being in or remaining in toxic relationships, as well as speaking publicly about it. Then for some reason, I started thinking about the center more often last fall. God really got my attention in a serious way in early December, when the frameless picture, usually many of you probably have seen those pictures, but there's no frame, it's just 4 clips. I have several of those with quotes that keep me energized on the wall behind my computer. One of them was hers with the Zara Abdili Center, and it fell off the wall and broke. The glass shattered. I have had clips for 20 years. Nothing has ever fallen off a wall. I thought that was God talking to me. I felt that was a sign for him telling me to wake up, get moving. But I still didn't pay enough attention, and he stepped in again. God stepped in again. I had joined a meetup group in December, and in the middle of January, we had our first meeting for 2020. After we introduced ourselves, we started talking about if there was anything that the group could help us with. And eventually I started talking about my purpose and what I was thinking about the center, because I thought of it more in terms of something long-term, not something that was going to happen right away. And as I was talking about it, one of the women across from me was staring at me, and I was very uncomfortable. And then she interrupted me, and she said, "Zara lived down the hall from me." And she's also a nurse. At that point, the hair on my back of my neck stood up. I was speechless. And I thought, if that wasn't God giving me a swift kick in the you-know-where, I don't know what is. I then started telling the group what I wanted the center to be. I told them that I believed women in shelters need to be touched, paid attention to, and pampered with things like massages, getting their hair done, manicures and pedicures, as well as learning things like yoga and meditations, things like that. And that a labyrinth would be the centerpiece of the center. Keep in mind that women in shelters are victims of violence of some kind, either sexual and/or physical, and often arrive at a shelter with nothing but what they're wearing on their backs. They've long since forgotten what it feels like to feel good about themselves, to be nurtured, to be pampered, to be put first, to feel that they have every right to be on this earth, and to feel that they're worthy of that right. My dream is to have them experience all of that at Zara's Center and experience it for free. Because keep in mind also, these women have no money. I also envision the services to be available to women who have been rescued from sex traffickers. Last fall, I attended the volunteer training for Victim Services Toronto. And in the final class, the lessons were about how the volunteers can deal with women who have been sex trafficked. It left me reeling. It's a horrible, horrible situation. So my calling or my purpose, whatever you want to call it, is twofold. One is to educate women about the insidious nature of toxic relationships, and two, to provide a safe place for them to heal from it. It has been a long and painful road, but I always had faith that somewhere in the midst of all that pain and heartache, there was a reason. Then I finally realized that I could use my experiences and knowledge to help others. God pointed me in that direction by pulling me through and not allowing me to let my thoughts about the Healing Center slide. In case you haven't figured it out by now, I've also been subjected to emotional abuse. That was the reason for my book, and that was the reason why Zara's death impacted me so strongly. For quite a while, I couldn't see past the pain, but now I realize that God was always there, encouraging me, holding my hand in the darkest moments, and pointing me towards the light. God is always there when we call, and we often don't call until we're at the end of our rope. Some of us never call believing God will not hear. However, nothing could be further from the truth. Isaiah makes it clear in chapter 58, a portion of which was read earlier, when he says in verses 8 and 9, "Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up speedily. Your righteousness shall go before you, and the glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard." Then you shall call upon the Lord, and the Lord will answer, and you shall cry, and he shall say, "Here I am." I grew up in the Methodist church. That's why coming to Trinity-St. Paul's was so familiar to me when I arrived in Canada. Church was a hugely important part of our lives, so my faith has always been strong. We even had special clothes when we were growing up for church. That was the only place we could wear those clothes. You couldn't play in them, you couldn't do anything else in them other than wear them to church. My brother and I started going to church in the womb. My immediate family and my extended family were heavily involved in the church, and until I left Barbados, I went to church at 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning, 3 o'clock for Sunday school, and 7 o'clock night service. The night Jillian, that would make sense to you. The night services were the hardest to live through because when I was a teenager, the island had just gotten television service with limited programming. We had a lot of older American shows, one of which was Bonanza. It came on at 8 o'clock on Sunday nights. And we would pray that whoever was preaching would not drone on past 8 o'clock. Because we had to race home to see as much of the show as we possibly could. All those years in church gave me a really strong foundation to put my faith in God, knowing that God will pull me through no matter what. God has my back. God will never fail me. God has been there for me in the bleakest of times. I won't lie, there have been times when I have forgotten about God. I've ignored him, but he's never let me do that. God doesn't like being put on the back burner. He's always there to turn up the heat and remind me why I'm here. Throughout the scriptures, there are times when God has been there for those who put their trust and faith in him. God is always urging us on, providing us a safe road down which we can travel, smoothing out the path, holding our hand in the bleakest times, pointing us towards the light, willing us to be open and see that light. As we read in Matthew earlier, you're the salt of the earth, but if that salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trodden underfoot by men. You're the light of the world. A city set upon a hill cannot be hid. Nor do men light a lamp and pull it under a bushel, but on a stand and give it light to all in the house. Let your light shine before men so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. God is calling us to shine our light, to let it be a beacon, to listen, to observe where we need to serve and answer the call. Isaiah heard the call as he related in chapter 6, verses 1 to 8. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I'm lost. For I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphims to me, having in his hand a burning coal, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lip. Your guilt is taken away and your sin is forgiven. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Then I said, Here I am. Send me. God is always calling us. What are you being called to do? Are you listening? There's something in your life that is calling your attention. Will you listen and answer the call as I did and as Isaiah did? Or will you continue to ignore what you know you're meant to do with your life? Only you can answer. God is waiting patiently for your answer. Amen.